Okay, hello again. So as I was just talking about, I set up a joystick. I'll explain a little bit more about what these uh, parameters mean. Um, Basically, anytime I want to use the joystick, I need it to be online, green. If it's yellow, that means you've clicked online, but it's not actually online. Either the joystick's unplugged, or Windows has lost track of it, or something like that. So this needs to be green. Live means you can move the joystick and it reads the values internally, and recording means it applies those to objects you attach them to while you're in record mode. So usually I've got all of these things checked, and will only uncheck them during a part of the process where I have to in order to see the data that's been baked. So just to let you know, the Xbox does not support all the joystick possibilities for the standard joystick axis. We get an XY axis and an RU axis. Um, this XY is the left thumbstick. X is usually the right left part, and Y is the up down part. The RU is the right thumbstick, and it's backwards basically on the Xbox controller. R should be right left, but it's actually up down, and U should be up down, but it's actually right left. I don't think that inverse changes which axis they are. I think it just changes the values from -100 to 0 or 0 to +100 or whatever. I don't mess with this. If I want to monkey with the numbers, I usually do it in the relation constraint. You can have more than one joystick attached. I've never used more than two. I can only really manage one at a time, but sometimes it's handy to have a second one. But for most things, one's enough, and if you structure the way the constraints are set up, that probably works out best. It's just that I run out very quickly of the ability to set poses if I only have a few analog controls. And frankly, these auto setting thumbsticks are terrible for pose testing anyway. I really need a console to be able to do that well, quickly anyway. And I don't have that, so I do the best I can with what I've got. Okay, so now that I've got a device set up, I'm going to go into constraints. I don't actually have to click on constraints, but I'm going to drag a constraint into the scene. Go over to Asset Browser, click on the constraint list. These are all the types of constraints you can throw into the scene. The ones I have a tendency to use often are chain IK. It's a little confusing because the label is underneath the icon, but they didn't change the distance between the uh, labels and the icons, so it's hard to tell which thing's on top of which thing. But chain IK is this one with the sort of gold chain going to a ball. Um, that's useful for normal IK. Aim constraints to make things point to others, and the one I use the most often is the relation constraint. There are others. I'll use anything, of course, that's needed to make things work. Um, but relation constraint is my bread and butter. I'm going to drag one into the scene. You can also drag it directly onto the constraint list. Um, that's usually safer because if you drag it over an object, it wants to constrain that object, and basically you want to control what it constrains, and it's easy to make a mistake dragging it into the scene, and then you have to undo it, and that's messy too. So I usually just drag it over into the constraint category in the navigator. So it comes up with this big grid of boxes, and there's nothing in there. We haven't made a constraint yet. There's no prompts. The constraints all look a little bit different if you pull in a chain IK constraint and then drag in a constraints list. Chain IK has a list of things that you're going to need to drag in here. The first joint in the IK chain, the last joint in the IK chain, an effector, any floor reference you want, and any pole vectors you want. Um, and then there's some information here about whether the constraint is active or not, and the other things you can do, whether it's weighted, blah, 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 blah. Going to delete that one again. So relations constraint looks different than that. It's just got this field where I'm going to have a bunch of objects Some of them are going to receive data, some of them are going to send data, and then I'm going to do things to the data in between. So this is equivalent to setting up an expression in Maya. You have all these tools to build your expressions with, converters, um, numbers are a key thing, so you can play around with values. There's system elements like transport control that are really helpful. Lots of toys in here to play with, depends on what problem you're solving, but there's some basic things that I tend to do over and over and over again. One of them is to use the joystick for control. So if I go down to my device list in the navigator and drag the joystick into this field, it knows the joystick is going to be a sender. That's the only thing the joystick can do, so it doesn't ask me. Normally, with an object that can do more than one thing, it'll ask me whether I want it to be a sender of data or a receiver of data. So I'm going to go up to my null that I made. It's it's the parent of the cylinder. I'm going to drag it over here, and it's going to ask me whether I want it to be a sender or a receiver. I want it to receive. It gives me a little box. Now, one thing to know is it makes this as a default a global element. Almost always, I want this to be a local element because it's part of a hierarchy. In this case, it wouldn't matter because I've got the null is just parented to the scene, so it would behave the same. But I would always right-click on the object as soon as you make it and click local transformations unless you're absolutely sure that what you want is global. So I could quickly attach something from the joystick to this and make it move around. I'm going to try to see if I can find a way to make this visible. Within the relations, you can use Alt left button to zoom in and out, and middle button to right and left. Navigation is basically the same as in the viewer, in other words. So you can move things around, zoom in and out. If you zoom out, you can make more boxes, but then you can't read the labels. So I'm constantly having to zoom in, out, move around to make things work here. So let's say that I want the right uh, thumbstick, which is this control here, R and U. Right is up, actually, of course, because that would be confusing. If I just connect it to the rotation on this null, it's going to put a box in between. That's because the rotation is actually a vector. It's got three values, x, y, z, and I've only got one value coming from the joystick that I attached, and it knows, didn't used to do this, it used to just fail. But it knows that the only way to do that is to add a number to vector box. So I could have also done that by going to converters, finding number to vector, dragging it into the scene, and connecting it. All it did was just automate something because it knows that there's no other choice really. If you want to do anything, it's got to be that. So if I move my joystick up and down now, I can see my object moving up and down. Yeah, I've created animation. Now it hasn't actually recorded anything, of course, and there's a few steps to get data recorded. But going back to the navigator and the graph schematic view of the relation constraint, if I right click in the middle of the graph, um, there's an option here to show all values, hide all unconnected, sync box selection with scene selection. I almost never use sync box selection with scene selection. Um, that's sometimes handy if you wanted to. But see, I just selected the joystick and it did not select the joystick. But it probably will if I had other objects. Let me make one. I'm going to do a test here because I haven't actually done this before. And add another null to the scene someplace. So it's listed now as null 1. I'm going to go back to the relation constraint. I'm going to bring null 1 in, make it a receiver, and I'm going to see if it does not in fact change. So that's why I don't use sync scene box with scene selection. It's kind of annoying. Let's try this. Nope, didn't do anything. So I would ignore that because I can't figure out how it works. But hide all unconnected is occasionally useful. The downside is if you actually want to see it again, you have to, tell the system to show everything again. I usually don't use that either, but I do use show all values a lot. Show all values will let you know what the numbers are. The only downside of that is the numbers get listed right next to the little connector box here, which is kind of hard to read when it's small, and it's even hard to read when it's big because there's a line going to whatever you're connected to that goes right over the top of it. But these numbers, as you move the joystick around, will tell you what values are being sent from the joystick and to the object. Now, most of the time, I'm not sending a raw value because I want the object to move in a certain way. So I need to add some other components to this. For example, one of the ones I use an awful lot, the two that I use the most are damp or damp clock based. Let me drag that in. And a scale and offset box. Once you have these two things, you can basically set up a range of a function and a speed. I usually use two dampeners because I found that with the algorithms that this uses, that's helpful. But one will be enough to give you an idea of what's going on. I'm just going to set a value of 100 to the dampener because it takes a bit of a value to be able to see it. And I'll turn it off and on in a minute to show you. I'll go back to R and connect it to X, which is the input of scale and offset here. So now I've got a connection all the way from the joystick through scale and offset, through the dampener, through the number to vector, to the null. If I disconnect any of this, I won't see anything happen on the object from the joystick. There has to be a continuous connection, and they have to be legitimate legal values. Sometimes the dampeners get out of whack if you set a number that's too high. This is just a note on an error, a Motionbuilder error. The numbers get high, something internally gets whacked out, and these will turn into gobbledygook. The numbers will no longer appear as 100, it appears a bunch of characters, and that's an indication that this is broken. And usually the only way I can fix it without making a bigger mess is to delete the dampener and bring it back in and replace it with a new one. That is absolutely a Motionbuilder bug. It's just one that comes up often enough that I mention it because it's very difficult to find. It just looks like everything's broken and there's no reason for it. Okay, so scale and offset has a scale factor. If I want something, if I'm dealing with a rotation and I'm dealing with a 0 to 100 rotation, then usually I'll use a decimal point for the degrees of rotation I want. If I want 30 degrees, I'll make it 0.3, because 0.3 times 100 is 30. And now I'll have exactly 30 degrees of rotation. If I right-click on Show All Values, the value coming out of scale and offset is 30 and 0, even though the number coming out of the joystick is 0 and 100. So I've just scaled down the object to a specific place. Offset is going to add or subtract values to that. So as another note is you can click on these values and just drag the mouse right or left, so you can sort of visually figure out where you want things to go. If you have a specific place you want this to be, it's easier to do that quickly. The downside is it's a little less accurate, so if you're trying to get an incremental, if it's very sensitive and you need to put 54.06, it's going to be easier to type it in. And for that, you double click and then type in the value. So anyway, I can make an object move now and control its range. So if I want to record it, basically what I need to do is press the record button, which down here on the transport is the little round button to the left. Or right take, yep, I do. And then press play. And then you move things around. You can see the time the transport moved. I'll hit stop now. And if I go back to the beginning and hit play, nothing happened. Oh my god, that's terrible. So nothing happened because the joystick is still overriding the values. And since nothing is happening in the joystick, and the joystick is live and in recording mode, um, it's still driving everything. So if I want to see the data I just did, I have to go and I have to turn the joystick off. That's really annoying. I find it very annoying. Because usually when I'm recording, I want to do things quickly and efficiently, and this is an inefficient process for me. But it's the way I have to do things here. So one thing I do is try to avoid having to go too much into the interface to do repetitive recording. So I don't have to go in and press buttons any more than I absolutely have to. So one thing I do is I use the transport control in the relation constraint to make things a little easier. If I go to this list of constraint settings, go under System, click on Transport Control, drag it into the scene, make it a receiver. It can be a sender, but I don't want it to be a sender right now. And then I just need to attach some buttons that are going to make sense. Well, I happen to know the 7 button is the back button, because I printed out that list and I've been doing this a bunch of times. I'm going to use that for go to beginning, so I can go to the beginning of the scene easily. 8 is the system, or it's the right button to the right of the back button. I always forget what it's called. And I want that to be record, and then I will set the A button to blank. All right. So now when I'm pressing A now. It plays. Press A, it stops again. Press the back button, it goes back to the beginning. Press the you can look and see what this is. So start. And it goes into record mode. So I can record over and over again without having to use the keyboard or anything like that, which is handy. So I'm going to hit play now, and I'm going to record this again. Slightly different profile. Do it for a while and hit stop. Hit the A button again, and it stopped. I need to find a quick way to do this, but currently I have to go to joystick, click online so it's offline, or at least unclick recording. But anyway, I have to go here and unclick something so the joystick no longer attaches to anything. And then I can see my data. If it's what I want, I think I did an okay job with it and I want to record it, I have to go and bake it at the joint that I wanted to record to. In my relation constraint, the thing I'm attached to is the null. I haven't renamed it or anything. So if I go up to the null in the scene list, and then go over to F curves, and click on the selection, the thing I want to bake, I use key controls, which is a tiny little window, to bake animation. At the top, there's this animation menu. Click on it, plot selected. Want to do 30 frames a second? Yes. Usually I just use the defaults here unless I'm doing something really specific. And look, my curve came on. The reason I want to do just the selection is because usually I'm kind of picking and choosing where my data is coming from and where it's going to, and I'm doing things 1 or 2 at a time. But now this is written in, so I can edit it. However, this is an important point. If I go and I edit this curve now, I won't actually see it play back in the viewer window until I remove it from the constraint. It's still going to be driven by the data that I recorded to the joystick that's sitting inside this joystick layer. And it's still going to drive that data through to here and override the values in the F curves window. So I can either make it inactive. If you see over here in constraint settings, there's an active button. I can make the entire constraint inactive. I can also just disconnect that box so it's no longer receiving data. If you have a very complicated constraint, it's kind of messy to go through and disconnect and reconnect these, which is another issue I have with this process. It's not as efficient as I would like it to be. But that's one way to do it. If I set up the constraints so that I can deactivate them without messing up anything else, um, I'll do that. But for example, if you have some IK sending in, components here or something like that that are critical for other aspects of the rig to look right, they'll stop working if you make this inactive. So I usually try to separate out my constraints so that that will all work. But now that I've disconnected the object or deactivated the constraint, go back to the null, and now I can adjust animation as I need to. And notice that it sampled all the data I generated. So I've got keyframes on every frame. For editing purposes, that's usually a real pain. So I often select everything, and then I'll use a filter. Sometimes the filters show up in the asset browser, but they're right there. I'm going to go to Window now. Look down to Filters. Brings up another window. I've selected the data that I just created, and I'm going to go down to the list. Key reducing, preview, and if the curves look okay, I'll accept. It does make slight modifications to the data, but usually they're fairly minor, and I'm usually making adjustments anyway at this point, so I usually don't mind the key reducer. It makes things a lot easier for me to manage when I'm editing data. And then if the curve isn't quite what I want, smooth things out, move things around, see the changes happening, but you would not see them happening if you had not disconnected the constraint. So anyway, then save your file, and you've got this value, this data available. It'll show back in Maya. You can do anything else you want to with it. Usually, I'm overlaying lots of other objects to get there. And, you use the same process to take IK or any other constraint and apply it to specific nodes. Um, you have to bake it from when the data is being applied to the node, and then disconnect the constraint, and then you'll see it in the F curves. So anyway, I'll wrap that up because it's been a very long video already. There you go.